The hook. Marcus stepped through the threshold of locker #247, his flashlight beam cutting through decades of dust and shadow. The smell hit him first, not the usual cocktail of mildew and mothballs that plagued most abandoned units, but something sharper, metallic, like old pennies left in a pocket too long. The front section looked ordinary enough. Cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, their corners soft with moisture and time. A few pieces of furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Marcus had seen it all before in his 3 years working the storage auction circuit. Since retiring from the force, he'd become something of an expert at turning other people's forgotten junk into Sarah's future. He pulled out his phone and started recording, a habit that had saved him from more than one insurance headache. Locker 247, Sunrise Storage, October 15th. Initial assessment. He panned the camera across the visible contents, noting what looked like a mahogany desk partially visible beneath a tarp, some oil paintings leaning against the far wall. The other bidders had already moved on to the next unit, their voices echoing from deeper in the facility. Marcus preferred it this way, alone with his haul, able to work methodically without curious eyes watching his every move. 23 years of detective work had made him cautious about revealing too much too soon. He started with the boxes nearest the entrance, pulling them aside to create a pathway deeper into the unit. Most contained what he expected: old books, kitchen implements, photographs of people whose names had been forgotten before Marcus was even born, the kind of detritus that accumulates in every family's corners and closets. It was when he moved the 7th box that he noticed something odd. The space behind the stacked belongings seemed to extend further back than the unit's dimensions should have allowed. Marcus had memorized the facility's layout during his previous visits. These standard units were 12 by 24 feet. But his flashlight beam was hitting a wall that should have been 4 feet closer. He squeezed between 2 towers of boxes, following the beam of light toward the back wall. That's when he saw it. The false wall was well constructed, nearly seamless, except for a thin gap at floor level where decades of settling had created a finger-width opening. Marcus knelt and peered through the crack. His flashlight revealed another room beyond, larger than it had any right to be. His pulse quickened, the same rhythm he used to feel when a case was about to break wide open. This was either a construction error that had given him free bonus space, or someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide something behind a fake wall in a storage unit. Given that the previous owner had vanished in 1947, Marcus was betting on the latter. It took him 20 minutes to find the mechanism, a section of the false wall that pivoted on hidden hinges when he applied pressure to a specific corner. The engineering was sophisticated, the kind of work that required both skill and serious motivation. The hidden room beyond made his breath catch. It was a barbershop. Not just any barbershop, but something that looked like it had been lifted directly from the 1940s and preserved in amber. 2 ornate chairs sat facing an enormous mirror, their red leather seats cracked but still holding their shape. Glass shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles of pomade and aftershave, their labels faded but readable. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but beneath it, Marcus could see the quality. This wasn't some neighborhood clip joint. This was the kind of place where important men came to be groomed, but it was the floor that made his detective instincts scream. Dark stains spread across the black and white checkered tiles in patterns that Marcus's trained eye recognized immediately. Blood. Lots of it. Too much to be from the occasional nick or shaving accident. He pulled out his phone again, documenting everything. The chairs, the mirrors, the bottles, the stains. His hands were steady, muscle memory from countless crime scenes, but his mind was racing. What kind of person builds a secret barbershop in a storage unit? And what had happened in this room that left the floor looking like a slaughterhouse? Marcus approached the nearest chair, noting how it was positioned to give the occupant a perfect view of themselves in the mirror. On a small table beside it sat an array of straight razors, their ivory handles yellow with age. One in particular caught his attention, longer than the others, its handle carved with intricate details that seemed to shift in the flashlight beam. He reached for it without thinking, the same instinct that had always driven him to examine evidence firsthand. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, the world exploded into fragments of someone else's memory. A man in the chair, begging, the razor singing through air, blood mixing with lather and tears. Marcus jerked his hand back, dropping the razor. It clattered against the tile, the sound echoing in the small space like a gunshot. His heart hammered as he stared at his trembling fingers. 23 years of police work, and he'd never experienced anything like that. Marcus stood frozen in the barbershop for another full minute, staring at the razor on the floor like it might bite him. The vision, or whatever the hell that had been, felt more real than the dusty air he was breathing. He could still taste the phantom copper of blood on his tongue. His phone buzzed. "Sarah, Dad, you at another auction? How'd it go?" Marcus blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. Back to why he was here in the first place. "Yeah, sweetheart. Got a good one today, I think. Please tell me it's not another storage unit full of romance novels and broken blenders." Despite everything, he smiled. Nothing like that. This one might actually be worth something. He backed out of the hidden room, suddenly desperate for fresh air. "How's campus life treating you?" "Expensive," she said with a laugh that didn't quite hide the worry underneath. "Speaking of which, the bursar's office called about next semester's payment plan. We should probably talk about that soon." Marcus's stomach tightened. They always should talk about it soon. The conversations that started with cautious optimism and ended with Sarah insisting she could take a year off, find a job, help out. The conversations that reminded him exactly why he was crawling through storage units instead of enjoying retirement. "We'll figure it out, kiddo. We always do. Dad, you don't have to. I'm your father. It's literally my job." He was walking back through the regular storage area now, past the boxes and furniture that suddenly seemed quaint after what he'd just seen. Besides, this storage auction thing is starting to pay off. Last month's Victorian dresser brought in $800. What he didn't mention was that $800 barely covered his own rent, let alone her tuition. What he didn't say was that he'd been living on peanut butter sandwiches for 3 weeks to make sure her meal plan payment went through. "I love you, Dad. Love you too, Sarah, more than you know." After she hung up, Marcus stood in the ordinary section of the storage unit and felt the weight of every choice that had led him here. Retiring at 44 after Jenny's death because he couldn't focus on cases anymore. Turning down the security consulting jobs that would have paid well but kept him chained to a desk. Choosing this ramshackle life of auction hunting because it felt like the only thing he could control. 3 years of digging through other people's abandoned lives, and what did he have to show for it? A studio apartment in Astoria, a 12-year-old Honda Civic, and a daughter who was too proud to admit she was scared about money. He looked back toward the hidden barbershop. Whatever was in there, whatever had happened in that room decades ago, it felt like the kind of discovery that could change everything. The furniture alone looked valuable. Authentic 1940 pieces in remarkably good condition. The bottles, the mirrors, even the chairs could bring serious money from the right collectors. But that vision when he'd touched the razor. Marcus shook his head. Stress did funny things to people. He'd seen cops crack under less pressure than he was carrying. Maybe his mind was just playing tricks, creating mysteries where none existed because that's what he was trained to do. Find patterns, see crimes in shadows. His phone rang again. This time it was Tommy Brennan, his old partner from the 7-8. "Marcus, you son of a bitch. Please tell me you're not still playing treasure hunter in Queens." "Pays the bills, Tommy." "Barely. Listen, I've got a real opportunity for you. Private security for a banking firm in Manhattan. Steady pay, good benefits, boring as hell but respectable work. Interested?" Marcus found himself looking back toward the hidden room again. "I'll think about it." "What's to think about? You're 47 years old, living like a college student, digging through garbage for pocket change. Jenny wouldn't have wanted this for you." The mention of his wife hit like it always did, a sucker punch that left him breathless. "Don't, Tommy. Someone has to say it. You're wasting away out there." After Tommy hung up, Marcus sat on a covered chair and stared at his hands, the same hands that had touched that razor. The same hands that used to solve murders instead of hunting for antiques to flip. Maybe Tommy was right. Maybe this whole storage auction phase was just elaborate avoidance, a way to postpone making real decisions about his life. Sarah would graduate in 2 years if the money held out. Then what? More storage units? More lonely mornings bidding against retirees and dealers? But then he thought about the barbershop, about the craftsmanship in that hidden room, the obvious value of what he'd found, about the possibility, for the first time in months, of actually getting ahead instead of just barely keeping up. One good score. That's all he needed. One find that could set Sarah up properly, maybe even give him some breathing room to figure out what came next. He stood up and walked back toward the hidden entrance, his flashlight beam steady in his hand. Time to get back to work. Marcus stepped back into the hidden barbershop, his flashlight beam sweeping across the vintage chairs and blood-stained floor. The razor still lay where he'd dropped it, its ornate handle gleaming against the checkered tiles like an accusation. He approached it carefully this time, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket before picking it up. No visions, just cold metal and carved ivory. Maybe stress really was getting to him. 3 years of financial pressure, sleepless nights worrying about Sarah's future, living on ramen and hope. It was enough to make anyone see things that weren't there. He wrapped the razor carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Whatever had happened in this room, the contents were valuable. That's what mattered now. Marcus spent the next hour cataloging everything with methodical precision. The chairs were genuine 1940 Koken models, worth at least $3,000 each to the right collector. The mirror was beveled glass in an original frame. Another $1,500, maybe $2,000. The bottles of pomade and aftershave, if authentic, could bring serious money from vintage enthusiasts. He was photographing a particularly ornate bottle when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, Detective Delacroix. Some secrets should stay buried." Marcus stared at the screen, his blood chilled. Nobody knew he was here. Nobody knew what he'd found. He'd bought the locker under his name, sure. But there was no way anyone could know he'd discovered the hidden room so quickly, unless someone had been watching. He moved to the entrance of the barber shop and listened. The storage facility was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on Northern Boulevard. The other bidders had left hours ago. Even facility manager Rodriguez would be gone by now. The place closed at 5, and Marcus had paid extra for after-hours access. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the same unknown number. Marcus hesitated, then answered. "Who is this?" Heavy breathing on the other end, then a gravelly voice. "Vincent Torino sends his regards." The line went dead. Marcus's hands shook as he lowered the phone. Vincent Torino. He'd never heard the name before, but something about it made his skin crawl. The voice on the phone had sounded old, strained, but deadly serious. His detective instincts kicked in automatically. Someone was watching him, someone who knew about this room, about what he'd discovered, someone who wanted him to walk away. Which meant whatever was hidden here was worth more than just vintage barbershop equipment. Marcus pulled out his laptop and connected to the facility's Wi-Fi. A quick search for Vincent Torino brought up results that made his mouth go dry. Vincent the Barber Torino, suspected enforcer for the Lucchese crime family. Active in the 1940s, believed responsible for at least 15 murders, though police could never make charges stick. Disappeared in 1947 after witnesses started turning up dead. Marcus scrolled through decades-old newspaper articles, photos of crime scenes, headlines about missing persons, and in every article the same detail: victims were found with precise cuts to the throat, the work of someone skilled with a straight razor. The barbershop suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Marcus was sitting in what might be Vincent Torino's personal killing room. The blood on the floor, the chair positioned to face the mirror. It all made horrible sense. Torino would bring his victims here, sit them down for a shave, and make their last sight their own terrified reflection. His phone rang again. This time it was Tommy. "Marcus, where are you? I've got 3 missed calls from some guy claiming he's your business partner. Says you found something that belongs to his family and he wants to discuss terms. What the hell are you into? I don't have a business partner, Marcus said, his voice tight. What did this guy sound like? Old, Italian accent. Called himself Vincent something. Said he'd been looking for what you found for a very long time. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Vincent Torino had supposedly disappeared in 1947. That was 76 years ago. Even if he'd been 20 then, he'd be nearly 100 now. Tommy, I need you to listen carefully. Don't give that guy any information about me. Nothing. And if he calls back, get a number. Marcus, what's going on? Before he could answer, Marcus heard footsteps echoing from somewhere in the storage facility. Slow, deliberate steps getting closer to his unit. I have to go, he whispered into the phone. Marcus killed his flashlight and moved to the front of the storage unit, peering through the gap in the roll-up door. A figure was walking down the corridor, elderly, wearing a long coat despite the October heat. The man stopped directly in front of locker #247 and smiled. Detective Delacroix, the man called out in the same gravelly voice from the phone. We need to talk. Marcus faced a choice that would define everything that came next. Open the door and confront whatever this was head-on, or stay hidden and hope the nightmare would pass. But as he looked back toward the barbershop, he realized the nightmare was just beginning. Marcus pressed his back against the cold metal of the storage unit wall, his heart hammering so loud he was certain the old man outside could hear it. Through the narrow gap in the roll-up door, he watched the figure in the long coat stand perfectly still, as if he had all the time in the world. I know you're in there, detective, the gravelly voice continued, conversational and patient. I can smell the fear. After 76 years, you develop a nose for these things. 76 years. The same number Marcus had calculated. If this really was Vincent Torino, he should be dead. Should have been dead for decades. Yet there he stood, looking maybe 70 at most, with the kind of stillness that only came from absolute confidence. Marcus's rational mind scrambled for explanations. A relative, maybe. A son or grandson who'd taken on the family business. But the voice on the phone had been the same one talking to Tommy, and something deep in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 23 years of police work, told him this was exactly who it claimed to be. His phone buzzed with a text. Your daughter has a lovely smile. Especially in that photo from last week's homecoming dance. Marcus's blood turned to ice water. Sarah. How could this man know about Sarah? He'd been so careful to keep his family life separate from his work, even back when he was active duty. Now, 3 years into retirement, living a quiet life of storage auctions and antique hunting, there was no reason anyone should be watching his daughter. Unless they'd been watching much longer than he thought. Another text arrived, Columbia University. Pre-med. Dean's List 3 semesters running. Such a bright future ahead of her. Marcus's hands shook as he stared at the screen. This wasn't just about the barbershop anymore. This was about Sarah. About the only thing in his life that truly mattered. The man outside somehow knew exactly where to apply pressure. Exactly which nerve would make Marcus dance to whatever tune he wanted played. Just a conversation, detective, the voice called out, closer now. 5 minutes of your time, and then you can go back to your little treasure hunt. Pretend you never found what you're not supposed to find. Through the gap, Marcus could see expensive shoes, Italian leather, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month. This wasn't some street-level thug making threats. This was someone with resources, connections, the kind of reach that could find out about Sarah's college schedule and homecoming photos. Marcus thought about the razor in his jacket pocket, wrapped in his handkerchief, the vision he'd experienced when he first touched it. What if it wasn't stress or exhaustion? What if something supernatural really was happening here? Something that connected him to whatever Vincent Torino had been. But supernatural or not, the man outside was real. The threats against Sarah were real, and Marcus was trapped in a storage unit with nowhere to run and no backup coming. He could call the police, but what would he tell them? That a mobster who supposedly died in 1947 was threatening his daughter because he'd found a hidden barbershop? They'd think he'd finally cracked under the pressure of retirement, started seeing conspiracies where none existed. Tommy would come if he called, but that would just put his old partner in danger too. And besides, what could Tommy do against someone with the kind of resources this man clearly possessed? Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think like a detective instead of a terrified father. What did this Vincent want? He'd said something about what you're not supposed to find, presumably the barbershop, the evidence of decades-old murders. But why now? Why emerge from whatever shadow he'd been hiding in for 76 years? Unless Marcus had disturbed something by touching that razor, set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The footsteps outside grew closer, and Marcus realized he was out of time. He could stay hidden and hope the man eventually left, but that would mean living in constant fear for Sarah's safety. Or he could face this head-on, the way he'd faced every dangerous situation in his career, and hope his experience was enough to keep them both alive. But this felt different from any case he'd ever worked. This felt like standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing that once he took the next step, there would be no going back to his quiet life of storage auctions and antique hunting. Sarah's tuition money. That's what had started this. The desperate need to provide for his daughter, to make up for all the ways his life had fallen apart after Jenny's death. Now that same desperation might get them both killed. Marcus looked back toward the hidden barbershop one more time, then made his choice. He reached for the handle of the roll-up door, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The metal door rattled upward with a sound like thunder in the quiet facility. Marcus stepped into the corridor, his hand instinctively moving toward where his service weapon used to rest, finding only empty space beneath his jacket. 3 years of civilian life, and he still reached for a gun that wasn't there. The old man turned slowly, as if he'd been expecting this moment his entire life. Up close, he looked exactly like the newspaper photos Marcus had found online. The same sharp cheekbones, the same predatory eyes. But those photos were from 1947. This man should be dust and bones by now, not standing here in a $1,000 coat, smiling like death itself. "Detective Marcus Delacroix," Vincent said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. 23 years with the NYPD, retired after your wife's passing, one daughter Sarah currently studying at Columbia. He paused, letting the words sink in. You have excellent taste in storage units. What do you want? Marcus kept his voice steady, falling back on the calm he'd cultivated through hundreds of dangerous encounters. Never let them see you sweat. Never give them the satisfaction of knowing they've gotten under your skin. Want? Vincent laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. What I want, detective, is to undo 76 years of hiding, to stop running from what I am, what I was. He gestured toward the storage unit behind Marcus. You found my workshop, my sanctuary, the place where I practiced my art. Your art of murder, you mean. Such a limited perspective. Vincent stepped closer, and Marcus caught a whiff of something ancient, old tobacco, bay rum aftershave, and underneath it all, something that smelled like copper pennies. I was a craftsman, detective, an artist with a blade, every cut perfect, every death a masterpiece. Marcus's skin crawled, but he held his ground. The police were looking for you in 1947. What happened? Why disappear? Because I touched something I shouldn't have. Vincent's eyes glittered in the fluorescent lighting. An old straight razor passed down through 5 generations of my family. The moment my skin met that handle, I saw things, learned things, became something more than human. The razor in Marcus's pocket seemed to grow heavier. What kind of things? The faces of everyone who died on that blade. Their memories, their final moments, their unfinished business. Vincent's smile was all teeth. But more than that, I saw the future. Saw that my time as Vincent Torino was ending, but my work was eternal. So you faked your death. I became something new, something patient. Vincent pulled out his own phone and showed Marcus the screen, a photo of Sarah walking across Columbia's campus, taken less than 24 hours ago. I've been waiting for the right person to find my workshop, someone with the skills to appreciate what I built, someone with enough to lose that they'd be properly motivated. Marcus felt his world tilting off its axis. You've been watching my family. I've been watching many families, detective. Following bloodlines, studying patterns, waiting for the stars to align. Vincent pocketed the phone. Your grandfather, detective. Did you ever wonder what really happened to him in 1947? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. His grandfather, Patrick Delacroix, had vanished when Marcus was barely 2 years old. His father had spent decades searching, hiring private investigators, following dead-end leads. The family had always assumed Patrick had simply walked away from his responsibilities, started a new life somewhere else. You didn't, Marcus whispered. Patrick Delacroix, construction worker, gambling debts to the wrong people. Vincent nodded slowly. He was my last piece of work before I had to disappear. Beautiful death, quick, clean, artistic. I kept a lock of his hair. Rage flooded through Marcus, hot and pure and dangerous. This monster had murdered his grandfather, destroyed his family, and now stood here bragging about it like it was some kind of accomplishment. His hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming at him to attack, to tear this creature apart with his bare hands. But Vincent was still holding all the cards, still had photos of Sarah, still had whatever supernatural power had kept him alive for 7 decades. The razor chose you, detective, Vincent continued, oblivious to Marcus's fury, or simply unconcerned by it, just as it chose me. You've touched it now, seen what it can show you, and whether you like it or not, you're part of this story now. I'll destroy it, melt it down, throw it in the river. You could try. Vincent's smile widened. But the visions will continue, the hunger will grow, and eventually you'll realize that fighting your nature only makes the eventual surrender so much sweeter. Marcus stared at this impossible man, this living nightmare from his family's past, and understood that his quiet life of storage auctions and antique hunting was over. Whatever came next would be written in blood and choices he wasn't ready to make. But Sarah was counting on him, and Vincent Torino had made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened the wrong man's daughter. You're making a mistake, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the rage coursing through him. I'm not the kind of man who breaks easy. Vincent's laugh echoed off the concrete walls. Oh, detective, you misunderstand completely. I'm not here to break you. He reached into his coat and produced an ornate wooden box, its surface carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. I'm here to complete you. The box seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. Marcus felt the razor in his pocket grow warm, responding to whatever was contained within those carved walls. 76 years, Vincent continued, running his fingers lovingly over the box's surface. 76 years I've carried this burden alone. Do you know what it's like, detective? To live with the memories of 17 different deaths? To feel their final heartbeats as if they were your own? Sounds like justice to me. Justice? Vincent's eyes flashed with genuine anger for the first time. You think this is about justice? This is about survival, detective. About feeding something that grows hungrier with each passing year. He opened the box, revealing a collection of items Marcus's rational mind refused to process. Locks of hair, dried blood on silk handkerchiefs, and in the center, a photograph of his grandfather that looked impossibly fresh despite being decades old. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, Dad. Someone's been asking questions about you at school. I'm scared. Sarah Vincent hadn't just been watching. He'd made contact. What did you do? Marcus lunged forward, but Vincent stepped back with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades avoiding consequences. Nothing yet, Vincent said calmly. But the night is young, and Columbia's campus is so poorly lit, so many dark corners where accidents could happen. He closed the box with a soft click. Unless, of course, we come to an understanding. What kind of understanding? You've touched the razor. You've seen what it can show you. But those were just glimpses, detective. Shadows of the real power. Vincent began walking deeper into the storage facility, forcing Marcus to follow or lose him in the maze of units. The barbershop was my workshop, yes, but it was also my school. Each death taught me something new about the craft, about the art of taking life. They passed rows of identical metal doors, each hiding its own secrets. Marcus's footsteps echoed hollowly, but Vincent's made no sound at all, as if he barely existed in the physical world. "I'm not a killer," Marcus said. "Neither was I once." Vincent stopped beside a unit marked 13th, its lock already cut away. "But the razor changes you, detective. Slowly at first, then all at once. You'll start noticing things, the pulse point in people's necks, the way their breath catches when they're afraid. The hunger will whisper to you in quiet moments, showing you how easy it would be, how right it would feel." Vincent rolled up the door of unit #13, revealing something that made Marcus's blood freeze. It was another barbershop, newer than the one in locker #247, but arranged in exactly the same way. 3 chairs, mirrors positioned to catch every angle, and tools laid out with surgical precision. "I've been busy, detective. Preparing." Vincent ran his hand along the back of the center chair. "This is where you'll learn, where you'll discover what the razor really wants from you. I won't do it. Whatever sick game you're playing." "Game?" Vincent spun around, his face twisted with something beyond anger. "You think this is a game? I've spent 76 years trying to satisfy something that can never be satisfied. 76 years of feeding a hunger that only grows stronger. And now, finally, I've found someone who can share the burden." Marcus felt something shift in the air around them, a pressure that made his ears pop. The razor in his pocket was burning now, hot enough to sear through the handkerchief and into his skin. "The rules are simple," Vincent continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "One life every new moon. Clean, precise, artistic. The razor feeds, and in return, it grants you things. Longevity, perception, the ability to see through the lies people tell themselves." He gestured toward the barbershop. "I've left detailed instructions, techniques perfected over decades of practice. All you have to do is choose your first subject. And if I refuse?" Vincent smiled and pulled out his phone, showing Marcus a new photo. Sarah walking into her dorm building, unaware of the figure following 20 feet behind her. "Then you'll learn what it feels like to lose everything that matters, just as I did when the hunger first took hold." Vincent's voice dropped to a whisper. "But it doesn't have to be that way, detective. Join me willingly and Sarah lives. Fight me and she becomes the first lesson in your education." Marcus stared at this monster, this impossible thing that had murdered his grandfather and now threatened his daughter, and realized he was standing at the crossroads of his entire life. Marcus felt time crystallize around him, each second stretching like taffy as he stared into Vincent's ancient eyes. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on his shoulders. His daughter's life balanced against his soul, 76 years of accumulated evil demanding a successor. "I need time to think," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "Time?" Vincent laughed, the sound echoing off the storage unit's metal walls. "Detective, time is the one thing you don't have. The hunger doesn't wait for convenient moments. It doesn't care about your moral compass or your protective instincts." He gestured toward the pristine barbershop setup. "Look around you. This isn't a negotiation, it's an inheritance." The razor in Marcus's pocket pulsed with heat, and for a terrifying moment, he could feel something else stirring in his mind. A whisper that sounded almost like his own thoughts. "Take the blade. Feel its weight. Understand what you were meant to become." He jerked his hand away from his pocket, but the damage was done. Vincent had seen the recognition in his eyes. "You're beginning to understand," Vincent said softly. "The razor doesn't just cut flesh, detective. It cuts through the lies we tell ourselves. The pretense that we're civilized, that we're different from our ancestors who painted caves with blood and offered beating hearts to hungry gods." Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. "Dad, there's a man outside my dorm. He knows your name." "Call him off," Marcus said, his voice barely controlled. "Whatever you want from me, she's innocent." "Innocent?" Vincent stepped closer, and Marcus caught another whiff of that ancient smell. Bay rum and copper pennies, and something darker underneath. "Detective, Innocence is a luxury you lost the moment you touched that razor. Your daughter stopped being innocent the moment she became leverage. The fluorescent light above them flickered, casting shifting shadows across Vincent's face. For just an instant, Marcus saw something else beneath the human features, something old and patient and eternally hungry. "You have 12 hours," Vincent continued, checking an expensive watch that looked like it had been crafted in the 1940s. "The new moon rises tomorrow night. Choose your first subject by then, or I'll choose for you." He pulled out a manila folder and set it on the barber chair. "I've done the preliminary work. 3 candidates who won't be missed. Drug dealers mostly, men who prey on children." Despite himself, Marcus found his eyes drawn to the folder. "You've been planning this." "For decades, Detective. Ever since I realized the hunger was too much for one man to bear." Vincent's smile was all teeth and shadows. "Did you really think finding that storage locker was an accident? I've been watching your family for 3 generations, waiting for the right bloodline, the right temperament, the right combination of desperation and moral flexibility. I'm not morally flexible. We'll see." Vincent moved toward the exit of the storage unit, then paused. "The barbershop in locker #247. Consider it your classroom. The tools are still sharp, still eager to work." "And Detective?" He turned back, his eyes reflecting the fluorescent light like an animal's. "Don't try to run. Don't try to hide. The razor knows where you are now. It will always know." Marcus watched Vincent disappear into the maze of storage units, his footsteps fading until only silence remained. Then he was alone with the pristine barbershop, the manila folder, and the growing heat of the razor against his ribs. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah, his hands shaking as he dialed. "Dad?" Her voice was tight with fear. "Thank God. This guy, he's been standing across from my building for an hour, just watching." "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," Marcus said, his mind racing through possibilities. "I want you to go to your room, lock the door, and don't come out until morning. Don't answer your phone unless it's me. Don't open your door for anyone." "What's happening?" "Dad, you're scaring me." "I know, baby. I know. Just do what I say, okay? I'm handling it." "Should I call the police?" Marcus almost laughed at the irony. What would he tell them? That a dead mobster was blackmailing him into becoming a supernatural serial killer? No. "No police. Just stay safe. I'll call you in the morning." He hung up and stared at the manila folder on the barber chair. 3 lives. 3 men who, according to Vincent, deserved to die. Drug dealers who preyed on children. The kind of scum Marcus had spent his entire career trying to put away. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane, that he should call Tommy, call the FBI, call someone who could help. But the rational part of his mind was growing quieter, overwhelmed by something darker that whispered seductive truths about justice and necessity, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. Marcus reached for the folder, then stopped himself. Not yet. Not until he'd exhausted every other option. But even as he made that promise, he could feel the razor's hunger growing stronger, matching the fear in his heart with something far more dangerous. Marcus stood frozen in the pristine barbershop, the manila folder inches from his fingertips. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, clinical detail. The razor against his ribs felt like a brand now, burning through fabric and flesh straight to his soul. "Just look," whispered a voice that might have been his own thoughts. 3 names. 3 men who destroyed children's lives for profit. Where's the harm in knowing? His phone rang, shattering the silence. "Tommy's number." "Marcus, we need to talk." Tommy's voice was strained, official. "Something's happened." "I'm listening." Marcus found himself backing away from the folder, as if distance could protect him from the choice it represented. 3 bodies turned up in the East River today. Old wounds, Marcus. Real old. The ME says they've been dead for decades, but they just surfaced all at once. Tommy paused. "And Marcus?" "They all match missing persons reports from 1947. The storage unit suddenly felt impossibly small. Any identification? That's the thing. Perfect preservation, like they were kept on ice for 70 years. And Marcus, One of them had a barber's tools buried with him. Straight razor, scissors, the works, all of them engraved with the same initials, VT, Vincent Torino. The monster was cleaning house, erasing evidence, preparing for something new. Marcus closed his eyes and saw his grandfather's face from old photographs. The same strong jaw, the same dark eyes that Sarah had inherited. "I've got to go, Tommy." "Wait, there's more. The brass is putting together a task force. They want someone with your experience consulting, someone who understands old crime patterns." The irony was suffocating. They wanted him to hunt the very monster that was trying to make him its successor. "I'll call you tomorrow, Marcus." He hung up and immediately dialed Sarah's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. Panic clawed at his chest. She'd been answering all night, terrified but responsive. Now silence. His phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. "She's safe, for now. But midnight approaches, and I'm growing impatient. The folder, detective. Open it." Marcus stared at the manila folder on the barber chair. His daughter's life balanced on 3 names, 3 strangers whose deaths might buy her safety. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was exactly what Vincent wanted, desperation overriding judgment, fear corrupting moral certainty. But underneath the rational voice, something else was stirring. Something that remembered 17 different deaths through the razor's borrowed memories. Something that whispered about the elegant simplicity of permanent solutions. He picked up the folder. Inside were detailed dossiers, complete with photographs, addresses, and criminal records. Miguel Santos, 34, 5 arrests for dealing near elementary schools. Robert Chen, 28, known for cutting his product with rat poison and selling it to middle schoolers. David Kowalski, 42, suspected in the overdose death of a 13-year-old girl, but never charged due to lack of evidence. Vincent had chosen his targets carefully. These weren't random victims. They were predators who'd escaped justice, men whose deaths might actually make the world a better place. The kind of criminals Marcus had spent 23 years trying to stop through legal channels. The razor pulsed against his ribs, and suddenly he was seeing more than just photographs. Flashes of memory that weren't his own flooded his consciousness. Miguel laughing as he handed drugs to a 10-year-old boy, Robert counting money while paramedics worked on a collapsed teenager, David walking free from a courthouse while a mother collapsed in grief. "Or justice," whispered the voice in his head. "Not murder. Justice." Marcus shook his head violently, trying to clear the borrowed visions. This was how it started. Rationalization, justification, the slow erosion of everything he'd believed about right and wrong. Vincent had spent decades perfecting this seduction, finding the exact pressure points that would turn a good man into a monster. His phone rang again. Sarah's number. "Dad?" Her voice was small, frightened. "There's someone here, in my room. He says he wants to talk to you." The line went quiet for a moment, then Vincent's voice came through the speaker. "Detective Delacroix. I trust you've reviewed my suggestions? Let her go." Marcus's voice was barely human now, all pretense of civilization stripped away. "This is between us." "Oh, but it's not, Detective. This is about bloodlines, about inheritance, about the hungry thing that lives in that razor and demands to be fed." Vincent's voice carried an edge of anticipation. "Your daughter has her grandfather's eyes. Did you know that?" Patrick looked at me the same way when he realized what was happening. That moment when hope dies and understanding takes its place. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, some fundamental barrier between thought and action. The folder crumpled in his grip as 37 years of accumulated rage finally found its focus. "Midnight, Detective," Vincent continued. "Choose one name from that folder, or I'll make the choice for you. And I promise, my selection will be much more personal." The line went dead. Marcus stood alone in the pristine barbershop, surrounded by the tools of Vincent's trade, feeling the razor's hunger merge with his own desperate fury. Everything he'd learned, everyone he'd tried to protect, every moral certainty he'd built his life around, it all came down to this moment. 3 names on blood-stained paper. One impossible choice. And somewhere in the darkness, His daughter was waiting for him to decide who he really was. Marcus stared at the crumpled folder in his hands, feeling the weight of 3 lives pressing against his conscience like physical stones. The pristine barbershop around him seemed to pulse with malevolent anticipation, mirrors reflecting his fractured image back from impossible angles. In each reflection, he looked a little different, a little more hollow, a little more desperate, a little more like the monster Vincent wanted him to become. The rational plan had been simple: find Vincent, confront him, use his police training and connections to end this nightmare. But Vincent had been 3 steps ahead at every turn, a predator with 7 decades of experience hunting men who thought they understood the rules of the game. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the one number that might still matter. "Tommy, I need everything you've got on Vincent Torino, and I need it now. Jesus, Marcus, it's almost midnight. And where the hell are you? There's some kind of interference." "Just listen." Marcus's voice cracked. "Vincent Torino isn't dead. He's got Sarah. He wants me to—" The words died in his throat. How could he explain that a supposedly dead mobster was blackmailing him into becoming a supernatural serial killer? "Marcus, you're not making sense. Vincent Torino died in 1947. We found his body today, remember? In the river with the others." The phone crackled with static, and through the interference, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. Sarah screaming. Then Vincent's voice, distant but clear: "Time's wasting, detective." The line went dead. Marcus tried calling back, but his phone showed no signal. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting the barbershop in strobing shadows. On the mirror in front of him, condensation began forming letters: "Choose." He looked down at the folder, at the 3 faces staring back at him. Miguel Santos had dead eyes and a gold tooth that caught the light. Robert Chen looked like someone's younger brother, barely old enough to shave. David Kowalski wore a suit in his mugshot, the kind of man who hid behind respectability while destroying lives. The razor against his ribs was burning now, so hot he could smell his own flesh cooking. But when he reached for it, his hand stopped halfway. Some part of him, the part that had spent 23 years wearing a badge, the part that still believed in justice over vengeance, was fighting back. "You have another choice," he told himself. "You could let Vincent kill Sarah and refuse to become what he wants. At least she'd die innocent, and the cycle would end." The thought lasted exactly 3 seconds before paternal love crushed it like an insect. Sarah was everything good in his life. Everything pure that had survived his divorce and his cynicism and his growing obsession with the ghosts in storage locker #247. The idea of sacrificing her to preserve his own moral purity wasn't noble, it was monstrous. Marcus opened the folder again and spread the 3 dossiers across the barber chair. If he was going to damn himself, he'd do it with full knowledge of the choice he was making. Miguel Santos lived alone in a basement apartment 6 blocks from an elementary school. No family, no friends, just a network of suppliers and customers who saw him as either commodity or threat. His record showed escalating violence, possession, dealing, assault, suspected murder. The system had failed to stop him 5 times. But the system wasn't supposed to stop people with straight razors in storage lockers. The system was supposed to stop them with evidence and trials and justice tempered by mercy. Marcus's phone flickered back to life with a single bar of signal. A text message, a photo of Sarah zip-tied to a chair, Vincent's hand resting on her shoulder like a caring grandfather. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she was alive. Another message, Miguel Santos. 412 Riverside Drive, Apartment B. He's alone tonight, cooking his poison for tomorrow's children. Justice or daughter, detective. Choose now. The address was 10 minutes away. Marcus could be there in 5 if he ran the lights. 5 minutes to cross a line he'd spent his entire adult life defending. 5 minutes to become everything he'd once sworn to stop. He folded the dossiers and put them in his jacket pocket, next to the burning razor. His service weapon sat heavy on his hip, the tool of legal authority, of controlled violence sanctioned by law and society. But Vincent hadn't asked him to use his gun. He'd been very specific about the requirements. As Marcus left the storage facility, the October wind cut through his clothes like judgment itself. Behind him, the fluorescent lights in Unit #13 flickered once and went dark, leaving only the whispered promise of inherited damnation and the address of a man who would never see morning. The drive to Riverside Drive took 6 minutes through empty streets that seemed to bend away from his destination. When he arrived, Marcus sat in his car for 30 seconds, staring up at the darkened windows of apartment B, knowing that everything he'd been, father, detective, decent man, was about to die in that room. He touched the razor through his jacket and felt it sing. The revelation. Marcus climbed the stairs to apartment B, each step echoing in the narrow hallway like a countdown to damnation. The building reeked of despair and neglect, peeling paint, broken tiles, the accumulated weight of lives lived without hope or purpose. His hand rested on the razor through his jacket, feeling its unnatural heat pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. At the door, he paused. Through the thin wood, he could hear the faint sounds of movement. Footsteps, running water, the clink of glass on metal. Miguel Santos was inside, alive, breathing, unaware that death had come calling with a badge and a cursed blade. Marcus raised his hand to knock, then froze as understanding hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't about saving Sarah. It wasn't even about becoming Vincent's successor. This was about choice. The realization crashed through him with terrible clarity. Vincent could have killed Miguel Santos himself, had probably killed dozens of men just like him over the decades. He could have taken Sarah anywhere, hidden her beyond any hope of rescue. Instead, he'd orchestrated this elaborate dance, this moment of perfect moral ambiguity, because the choice itself was the point. Vincent hadn't been recruiting him to continue the killing. He'd been recruiting him to understand why the killing had started in the first place. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he'd memorized but never called, the one Tommy had given him 3 days ago when everything started unraveling. St. Mary's Hospital, Psychiatric Records Department. This is Detective Marcus Delacroix, NYPD retired. I need information on a patient from 1947. Patrick Delacroix, emergency authorization, family member inquiry. The line went quiet for several minutes. Behind the apartment door, Miguel Santos continued his midnight chemistry, mixing death for tomorrow's children while justice waited in the hallway with trembling hands. Detective, I have the file. Patrick Delacroix, committed October 15, 1947. Diagnosed with acute trauma response following witnessing of multiple homicides, patient claimed he was forced to watch a man named Vincent Torino murder 17 people in a barbershop basement. Delusions included belief that a supernatural entity had possessed Torino and that said entity was seeking a replacement host. Patient died of heart failure 6 weeks after commitment. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. He died in the hospital? Yes, sir. Never left the facility. But, detective, there's a note here from the attending physician. Patrick kept saying the same thing over and over. The razor chooses, but we can choose not to let it. Does that mean anything to you? The phone slipped from Marcus's numb fingers and clattered to the floor. His grandfather hadn't vanished. He hadn't been murdered by Vincent Torino. He'd been Vincent's first attempt at creating a successor, and he'd chosen madness over murder, death over damnation. The razor against his ribs suddenly felt different, not burning, but cold. Desperately, hungrily cold, like something starving that had been denied sustenance for 70 years. Marcus understood now why Vincent had been so patient, so methodical. He wasn't just a killer who'd found a supernatural edge. He was a prisoner, bound to something that demanded blood and required willing participation. Every murder had to be chosen, every death consciously embraced, because the thing in the razor fed not just on life, but on the moment when good men decided to become monsters. His grandfather had broken the cycle by refusing to choose, and in doing so, he'd trapped Vincent in an endless hunt for someone who would. Behind the apartment door, the sounds stopped. Footsteps approached. Miguel Santos was coming to investigate the noise in the hallway, walking toward the moment that would define two lives forever. Marcus reached for the razor, and for the first time since touching it, felt the choice was truly his. He could open that door and end Santos's predatory existence. He could feed the hungry thing that had been starving since 1947. He could save Sarah and damn his own soul in a single stroke of inherited steel. Or he could choose what his grandfather had chosen: madness, maybe death, but not murder. The door began to open. Marcus saw Santos's face appear in the gap, younger than the mugshots, hollow-eyed from his own poisons, suspicious but not yet afraid, a drug dealer, a predator, a man whose death might genuinely make the world better. And in that moment of perfect moral complexity, Marcus finally understood the true nature of the choice he'd inherited. It had never been about justice or vengeance. It had always been about whether he would choose at all. Marcus stepped back from the opening door, his hand falling away from the razor. Miguel Santos emerged halfway into the hallway, thin, wired, reeking of chemical sweat and paranoia. His eyes darted from Marcus's face to the dropped phone on the floor, calculating threat levels with the instincts of a lifetime predator. "You lost, old man." Santos's voice carried the brittle edge of someone riding a chemical high. "This ain't your neighborhood." "No," Marcus said quietly, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I'm exactly where I need to be." He pulled out his badge, retired, but Santos wouldn't know that in the dim hallway light. "NYPD. We need to talk, Miguel." Santos's face went through a familiar sequence Marcus had seen 1,000 times. Surprise, calculation, then the dawning realization that running was his only option. But instead of slamming the door or bolting down the stairs, Santos did something unexpected. He laughed. "Man, you picked the wrong night to hassle me. I got protection now, real protection." Santos's eyes held an odd gleam, something beyond chemical enhancement. "My new business partner don't like cops much." The temperature in the hallway dropped 10 degrees. Behind Santos, in the apartment's darkness, Marcus heard a slow, deliberate clapping. "Very good, detective." Vincent's voice drifted from the shadows. "I wondered if you'd make the connection." Marcus felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. Vincent hadn't been hunting him, he'd been hurting him. Every revelation, every choice, every moment of moral crisis had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this exact point. Not to force him to kill, but to force him to understand why he wouldn't. "Sarah's not here, is she?" Marcus asked. "Your daughter is safe at home, probably worried sick about her father's increasingly erratic behavior." Vincent emerged from the apartment looking exactly as he had in the barbershop. Ageless, pristine, carrying the weight of 7 decades like a well-tailored coat. She was never in danger. The photos were staged, the voice recordings crafted. Theater, detective, all of it theater. Santos looked between them, his drug-addled brain struggling to process the conversation. "What the hell is going on? You said you needed my place for a meeting. You said—" Vincent moved with inhuman speed, his hand closing around Santos's throat. The dealer's words dissolved into choking gasps. Mr. Santos served his purpose admirably. A perfect test case, genuinely deserving of death, conveniently isolated, morally expendable. Vincent's grip tightened. The question was never whether you could kill him, detective. The question was whether you would choose to. Marcus watched Santos's face turn purple, saw the life draining from his eyes, and felt absolutely nothing. No urge to intervene, no moral outrage, no desperate need for justice. Just cold, analytical observation. The man was dying, and Marcus had the power to stop it, and he was choosing not to act. The realization should have horrified him. Instead, it brought a strange kind of peace. "You're not feeding the razor," Marcus said. "You're starving it." Vincent's smile was genuinely pleased. 70 years I've waited for someone to understand. The entity doesn't feed on death, detective. It feeds on the moment when good men choose evil, when they cross that final line and embrace what they've always fought against. He released Santos, who collapsed gasping to the floor. But what happens when good men simply stop choosing altogether? The razor against Marcus's ribs had gone completely cold now. And he understood why. He'd reached the same point his grandfather had found in 1947, the place beyond moral complexity where choices became simple because they stopped mattering entirely. It starves, Marcus said, and eventually it dies. Eventually. Vincent's voice carried the weight of decades spent in limbo. But first, it drives its host to increasingly desperate measures. 70 years of watching monsters like Santos poison children while justice fails and good men wring their hands about proper procedure. His eyes held an inhuman hunger. Do you know how exhausting it is to care about justice when justice is just another word for systematic failure? Marcus looked down at Santos, still gasping on the dirty floor, and felt the last of his moral certainty drain away. The man would live tonight, would wake up tomorrow and continue destroying lives, would slip through legal loopholes and bureaucratic failures until someone else's daughter paid the price for society's squeamishness about permanent solutions. But Marcus wouldn't be the one to stop him, not because Santos didn't deserve to die, but because choosing to kill him would feed the thing that had been consuming Vincent for 7 decades. His grandfather had found the only way to break the cycle: stop choosing altogether. Stop caring about justice or vengeance or the greater good. Become morally inert, ethically void, as coldly practical as winter itself. It was, Marcus realized, its own kind of damnation. But it was also the only way Sarah would have a father who wasn't a monster. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice mechanical as he reported a suspected drug operation at 412 Riverside Drive. He gave his name, his badge number, and hung up before they could ask questions. The entire call took 47 seconds, enough time for Vincent to drag Santos back into the apartment, enough time for Marcus to walk away from everything he'd once believed about right and wrong. But he didn't walk away. Instead, he followed Vincent inside, stepping over the threshold into a space that reeked of chemical corruption and broken lives. The apartment was exactly what he'd expected. Mattress on the floor, card table covered in scales and plastic bags, windows painted black to keep out both light and judgment. Santos cowered in the corner, finally understanding he'd become a pawn in something far beyond his comprehension. "The police will be here in 8 minutes, Marcus said. "Santos will be arrested, processed, probably convicted this time. He'll serve 3 to 5 years, get out, and start again. The system will have functioned exactly as designed." Vincent settled into a broken recliner like a king claiming his throne. "And you'll go home to your daughter, having done the right thing, having preserved your moral integrity, while ensuring that children will continue to die from this man's poison." His smile was sharp as winter. "Tell me, detective, how does it feel to be so perfectly, uselessly good?" Marcus felt the razor pulse once against his ribs, a final desperate attempt to rekindle the fire of righteous anger. But the cold had settled too deep now, reaching places in his soul he'd never known existed. He looked at Santos, really looked at him, and saw not a monster to be destroyed but a problem to be managed. A piece of human debris that would cycle through the system until entropy or violence finally removed him from the equation. "It feels like watching someone drown while standing on solid ground," Marcus said. "Knowing you could save them, knowing you won't, and knowing that both choices lead to the same ending." "Exactly." Vincent stood, brushing imaginary dust from his immaculate suit. "You've learned what your grandfather learned. What I learned 70 years too late. The razor doesn't make us monsters, detective. It simply reveals that we were always choosing to be human despite our monstrous impulses." He moved toward the window, listening to the approaching sirens. "And when we stop choosing altogether, when we embrace the beautiful indifference of entropy, the entity starves," Marcus finished. "But so do we." Vincent nodded approvingly. Patrick understood this. He chose madness over action, death over damnation. But he also chose to abandon every person he might have saved through decisive action. Vincent's eyes found Marcus in the dim light. The question becomes, which damnation can you live with? The sirens were closer now, maybe 3 minutes away. Santos had stopped whimpering and was watching them with the calculating gaze of someone weighing his options for escape or cooperation. Marcus could see the wheels turning. Santos would trade information for reduced charges, would give up suppliers and customers, would play the system like the instrument it was. Some of those customers were children. Some of those suppliers were building networks that would poison entire neighborhoods. The information Santos carried could save dozens of lives if properly leveraged, or it could disappear into bureaucratic machinery that moved too slowly to prevent the deaths it was designed to address. "You want me to kill him," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. I want you to understand what you're choosing when you don't," Vincent replied. "I want you to feel the weight of every child who overdoses while Santos is protected by legal procedure. I want you to know that your moral purity comes at the cost of innocent lives." Marcus pulled the razor from his jacket. In the apartment's sickly light, it looked ordinary. Antique steel and worn bone handle, the kind of thing collectors paid good money for at estate sales. But when his fingers closed around it, he felt the entity stir. Felt it reaching toward the possibility of choice like a starving man reaching for bread. "And if I use it, then you save those children and damn yourself. You become what I became, a prisoner of your own righteous anger, bound to feed something that grows hungrier with every justified killing." Vincent's voice carried the exhaustion of decades. "There is no good choice here, detective. There is only choosing which price you're willing to pay." The sirens were on the street now, probably 30 seconds away. Santos was edging toward the back window, calculating his chances of escape. In moments, the decision would be taken from Marcus entirely. Santos would either flee or be arrested, and the natural course of events would proceed without supernatural intervention. Marcus raised the razor and felt the entity surge with anticipation. One stroke across Santos's throat, and the children would be safe. One moment of choosing evil for good reasons, and he would become the monster Sarah could never know he was. The footsteps on the stairs were heavy, purposeful. Justice climbing toward its appointment with systematic failure. Marcus closed his eyes and made his choice. The razor trembled in Marcus's grip as the entity pressed against his consciousness like a drowning man clawing toward air. He could feel its hunger, its desperate need for the choice that would finally break 70 years of starvation. One cut, one death. One moment of crossing the line he'd spent his entire career defending. But as the footsteps reached the landing outside, Marcus felt something else, the weight of every lesson he'd learned since touching the cursed blade. His grandfather's madness hadn't been surrender, it had been the ultimate act of defiance. Vincent's decades of imprisonment hadn't been punishment, they'd been the price of feeding something that should have been allowed to die. The door exploded inward as SWAT officers flooded the room, tactical lights cutting through the darkness like burning swords. "NYPD, everyone on the ground." Marcus dropped the razor and raised his hands, watching as Santos scrambled toward the back window only to find it blocked by officers rappelling from the roof. The dealer's face cycled through panic, rage, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as he realized his options had collapsed to cooperation or life imprisonment. "Detective Delacroix?" The lead officer's voice carried recognition and confusion in equal measure. "Sir, we need you to step away from—" The words died as the officer's flashlight beam found Vincent, still standing calmly by the window as if bulletproof vests and automatic weapons were mere theater. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Marcus watched frost form on the officer's tactical gear as something far older than law enforcement asserted its presence. "Vincent Torino," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the suddenly electric air, "also known as the Barber. Wanted in connection with 17 murders between 1943 and 1947. Vincent's laugh was like ice cracking on a winter lake. "Still playing detective, I see, even after everything you've learned." He gestured toward Santos, now zip-tied and bleeding from his desperate escape attempt. "Tell me, how many children will die while this man navigates the appeals process? How many families will be destroyed while lawyers debate constitutional protections for predators?" The SWAT officers shifted nervously, their training inadequate for whatever supernatural tension was filling the room. Marcus could see their confusion. Two suspects, one claiming to be a decades-dead serial killer, the other a known drug dealer, and somewhere in the middle a retired detective who'd led them to both. "Officer Rodriguez," Marcus called to the team leader. Miguel Santos has detailed knowledge of a distribution network targeting elementary schools. I recommend immediate federal cooperation in exchange for protective custody. The information he carries could save more lives than his conviction would serve. Santos's head snapped up, hope flickering in his drug-hollowed eyes. He understood the offer: betray his entire operation in exchange for witness protection. Give up every supplier, every customer, every safe house in exchange for a new identity, far from the retribution that would follow. Vincent's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching respect. Clever. Let the system cannibalize itself. Save the children by sacrificing the infrastructure that creates monsters like Santos in the first place. His eyes found Marcus across the chaos of shouting officers and rattling equipment. You've learned to think like me, detective. That should terrify you. But Marcus felt no terror, only the cold clarity that had replaced his moral certainty. He was manipulating the system, using Santos's survival instinct to achieve what justice couldn't accomplish through conventional means. It wasn't good or evil, it was simply effective. The razor, Vincent said quietly, his voice somehow audible despite the tactical chaos. You dropped it before making your choice. The entity is still bound, still waiting for someone strong enough to feed it properly. Marcus looked down at the ornate blade lying among the drug paraphernalia and police equipment. In the harsh LED light of tactical flashlights, it looked pathetic, a museum piece playing dress-up as an instrument of cosmic justice. But he could still feel its pull, still sense the thing inside reaching toward him with desperate hunger. It can wait, Marcus said. It can starve. Vincent nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a secret handshake. Your grandfather would be proud, and ashamed, and terrified of what you're becoming. His form began to waver, becoming translucent as the officers moved toward him. The test isn't over, detective. It never ends. Every day you'll face the choice between action and inaction, between justice and law, between saving lives and preserving your soul. The SWAT team reached Vincent's position and found only empty air, their tactical lights revealing nothing but frost-covered wallpaper and the lingering scent of old cologne. Rodriguez cursed and barked orders into his radio, but Marcus knew they wouldn't find him. Vincent Torino existed in the spaces between choices now, trapped by his own moral compromises until someone else picked up the razor and chose differently. As they led Santos away in federal custody and secured the scene for evidence collection, Marcus remained motionless, staring at the blade that had started everything. The entity inside pulsed weakly, starved but not yet dead, waiting for the next moment when justice would fail and someone would decide that good intentions justified monstrous actions. The final test had begun, and it would last the rest of his life. Marcus stood alone in the aftermath, watching the forensics team catalog evidence while Rodriguez coordinated with federal agents who'd materialized from the bureaucratic ether. The razor lay exactly where he'd dropped it, now tagged and photographed, but somehow untouched by the officers processing the scene. Even through latex gloves and professional detachment, they seemed to sense something wrong about the ornate blade. You going to tell me what really happened here? Rodriguez approached with the weary skepticism of a cop who'd seen too much weird shit to dismiss anything outright. Because my report's going to read like a fever dream, and I need to know how much of this actually occurred. Marcus watched them load Santos into an unmarked van, noting how the dealer's eyes kept searching the shadows as if expecting Vincent to reappear with supernatural retribution. Santos will cooperate. His information will shut down a network that's been poisoning kids for 3 years. Sometimes that's as close to justice as the system gets. That's not what I asked. Rodriguez lit a cigarette despite the crime scene protocols, his hands shaking slightly from the encounter with something that had no business existing. I've been a cop for 22 years, Delacroix. I know the difference between criminals and whatever the hell that thing was in there. The entity in the razor pulsed once, responding to Rodriguez's proximity like a predator sensing potential prey. Marcus could feel its desperate hunger reaching out toward the younger officer, testing his moral certainties, probing for the kind of righteous anger that had sustained it for 7 decades. Rodriguez was exactly the type it preferred. Good cop, frustrated by systematic failures, watching criminals slip through legal loopholes while victims paid the price. How many times had Rodriguez stood in courtrooms watching guilty men walk free on technicalities? How many nights had he gone home knowing that his best efforts weren't enough to protect the innocent? "Walk away, Miguel," Marcus said quietly. "Don't think about the blade. Don't touch anything Vincent might have handled. Go home to your family and forget this ever happened." "Can't do that." Rodriguez took a long drag, studying Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone piecing together an impossible puzzle. "Because tomorrow I'm going to wake up knowing that supernatural shit exists, that there are monsters wearing human faces, and that the only thing standing between them and innocent people is cops like us who don't have magic razors to level the playing field." The entity's hunger intensified, feeding on Rodriguez's growing frustration. Marcus could feel it reaching across the space between them, whispering promises of power and certainty in the face of systematic injustice. How easy it would be for Rodriguez to pocket the blade, to carry it home and spend sleepless nights contemplating all the monsters who'd escaped justice. "The razor doesn't level anything," Marcus said, moving between Rodriguez and the evidence table. "It just makes you into a different kind of monster, one that tells itself stories about greater good while feeding something that should have died decades ago." Rodriguez's cigarette trembled between his fingers as understanding dawned. "You've used it. That's how you knew where to find Santos. That's how you knew about the distribution network." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Jesus Christ, Delacroix." "How many?" "None." The word came out harsher than Marcus intended. "Because I finally understood what my grandfather figured out in 1947. The entity doesn't want justice. It wants good men to choose evil. It wants cops like us to cross lines we can never uncross." But even as he said it, Marcus could feel the terrible weight of that choice. Santos was alive, cooperating, providing information that would save children. But the next dealer was already setting up shop, and the one after that, and the one after that. The system would process information, make arrests, secure convictions, and more children would die while justice moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Rodriguez flicked his cigarette into the gutter, decision crystallizing in his eyes. "So, what's the alternative? Stand by and watch monsters destroy innocent lives because we're too moral to do what's necessary?" The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying the weight of every choice Marcus had avoided making. Behind them, the federal agents were discussing witness protection logistics, while forensics bagged evidence that would disappear into storage lockers for decades. The system functioning exactly as designed, slowly, carefully, inadequately. "The alternative," Marcus said finally, "is learning to live with the fact that sometimes there isn't a good choice. Sometimes there's only choosing which price you're willing to pay." Rodriguez started toward the evidence table, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had called to Marcus for weeks. But as his hand reached for the tagged razor, Vincent materialized behind him like winter fog taking human shape. "Choose carefully, Officer Rodriguez," Vincent whispered, his breath turning the air to frost. "Some hungers never end, and some justice comes at prices that compound daily for 70 years. Rodriguez's hand stopped inches from the blade, as Marcus felt the entity surge with anticipation, waiting to see if another good man would damn himself for all the right reasons. Rodriguez's fingers hovered over the tagged razor, trembling not from fear but from the weight of absolute choice. Marcus could see the calculation in the younger officer's eyes, every unsolved case, every plea bargain that let monsters walk free, every victim who would never see justice. The entity pulsed with anticipation, 70 years of starvation finally approaching its end. "Miguel, don't." Marcus stepped forward, but Vincent raised a spectral hand to stop him. "Let him choose," Vincent whispered, frost spreading across the evidence table. "Let him learn what your grandfather learned, what I learned, that sometimes the only way to save innocence is to sacrifice your own." Rodriguez's hand closed around the razor's handle, and the entity exploded into his consciousness like lightning into a copper rod. Marcus watched the younger man's face transform as visions flooded through him. Every child Santos had poisoned, every family destroyed by the network they'd barely scratched tonight. But more than that, every future victim, every monster the system would fail to stop, every moment when good men stood paralyzed by moral certainty while evil acted with decisive brutality. "I can see them," Rodriguez whispered, tears streaming down his face. "All the ones we won't save, all the ones dying while we fill out paperwork." His grip tightened on the blade. "There's a warehouse on Pier 47. Tomorrow night. Santos was supposed to be there, but now—" He looked up at Marcus with eyes full of terrible knowledge. "Someone has to go. Someone has to stop them." Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. The last vestige of the man who'd believed in clear moral lines, in the possibility of saving everyone. "Miguel, if you do this—" "I know." Rodriguez stood slowly, the razor steady in his grip. "I'll become what you refuse to become. I'll feed this thing inside the blade, and it will never be satisfied, and I'll spend the rest of my life choosing between damnation and watching innocence die." He smiled, and it was the most heartbroken expression Marcus had ever seen. "But those kids at the warehouse will live. Their families will never know how close they came to losing everything. That has to count for something." Vincent nodded approvingly, his form becoming more solid as the entity prepared for its first real feeding in decades. Pier 47. 17 men, all armed, all guilty of crimes that would never see conviction. You can save 24 children and remove monsters the system protects. Justice, finally. Marcus watched Rodriguez test the razor's edge against his thumb, saw the thin line of blood that sealed some invisible contract. The young officer's moral certainty was crystallizing into something harder and more terrible, the kind of absolute conviction that had sustained Vincent for 30 years of supernatural killing. "There's another choice," Marcus said desperately. "We can work the case properly, build evidence, make arrests, trust the system." The system failed those kids. The moment Santos started targeting elementary schools, Rodriguez cut him off. The system failed them when his lawyer negotiated witness protection instead of life imprisonment. The system fails them every day we choose procedure over results. He slipped the razor inside his jacket, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift in the world's balance. "I won't fail them." As Rodriguez walked toward his car, Marcus realized what victory had cost him. Not his life, not his sanity, but something more precious, the burden of choice itself. He'd refused to damn himself, and so Rodriguez had chosen damnation instead. The young officer would become what Marcus couldn't become, would feed the entity Marcus had starved, would carry the weight Marcus had set down. Vincent appeared beside him, no longer translucent but solid and real, sustained by Rodriguez's choice. "You saved yourself, detective. Congratulations. You'll go home to your daughter with clean hands and a clear conscience, knowing that someone else chose to become a monster so you wouldn't have to." Marcus watched Rodriguez's taillights disappear into the Queen's darkness, carrying the razor toward Pier 47 and whatever waited there. Tomorrow, 17 criminals would die violently, and 24 children would live to see adulthood. The newspapers would report a gang war, the police would investigate a drug deal gone wrong, and no one would ever know that supernatural justice had intervened where human systems failed. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Marcus whispered. "This is exactly what was supposed to happen," Vincent replied. "The entity doesn't care who feeds it, only that someone does. You learn to resist temptation, detective, but you also learn to pass that temptation to someone else. Congratulations, you've become me." Standing aside while good men damn themselves for all the right reasons. As the last federal agent drove away, leaving only empty streets and the lingering scent of old cologne, Marcus understood the true cost of his victory. He'd saved his soul by sacrificing Rodriguez's. He'd chosen moral purity over moral responsibility. He'd learned to live with himself by learning to let others die for him. The entity was fed. The curse continued. And somewhere in Queens, another good man was discovering what justice really cost. Marcus stood in the empty street long after the federal vehicles had disappeared, their red taillights swallowed by Queens' darkness. The crime scene tape fluttered in the October wind like prayer flags for the damned, marking a place where one man's salvation had become another's damnation. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah asking if he'd be home for breakfast, making pancakes before school. The mundane normalcy of it felt like a slap across his face. How did he explain to his daughter that her college fund had been bought with Officer Rodriguez's soul? Vincent materialized beside him, more solid now than he'd been since that first night in the storage locker. The entity's feeding had strengthened the connection between them, made the ghost real enough to cast shadows under the streetlights. "Regret is a luxury you can't afford," Vincent said, lighting a cigarette that shouldn't have been possible for a dead man. Rodriguez made his choice with full knowledge of the consequences. That's more than I had in 1947. Marcus thought about the young officer driving toward Pier 47, the razor heavy in his jacket, visions of future victims playing behind his eyes like a movie reel of preventable tragedies. By tomorrow night, Rodriguez would have blood on his hands and power flowing through his veins, addicted to the terrible clarity that came with supernatural justice. "How long?" Marcus asked. "How long before it destroys him completely?" Vincent took a long drag, considering. "Depends on how strong his moral center is. I lasted 30 years before the entity consumed me entirely. Rodriguez has that same righteous fury, that same inability to accept systematic failure. He might last longer, a pause. He might burn out faster." The weight of Marcus's choice settled over him like lead clothing. He could have taken the razor himself, could have fed the entity and saved Rodriguez from corruption. Instead, he'd chosen the harder path, living with the knowledge that someone else was paying the price for his moral purity. "My grandfather," Marcus said finally. "You said he figured it out in 1947. What happened to him?" Vincent's expression shifted, decades of accumulated guilt flickering across his features. "Thomas Delacroix was a good cop, too good. He tracked me down, cornered me in that barbershop, and demanded I surrender the razor." The ghost smiled bitterly. "I told him the same thing I told you, that the entity needed feeding, that monsters were walking free, while good men worried about due process. And he took the razor from me, said he'd rather damn himself than watch me corrupt any more good men." Vincent flicked his cigarette into the gutter where it disappeared before hitting the ground. "The entity killed him 3 days later, drove him to suicide rather than let him break the cycle. Your grandfather chose heroism over survival, and it destroyed him." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, but Rodriguez chose practical evil over paralyzed good. The entity feeds on that kind of moral compromise. It will sustain him for decades, as long as he keeps killing in the name of justice. Vincent turned to face him directly. "Your grandfather tried to end the curse. Rodriguez has ensured it continues. Guess which choice the entity preferred?" The implications crashed over Marcus like a wave. By refusing to take the razor himself, by forcing Rodriguez into that impossible choice, he hadn't broken the cycle. He'd perpetuated it. The entity would feed on Rodriguez's righteous fury until there was nothing left but hunger wearing the mask of justice. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. "Dad, you okay? Saw the news about the warehouse raid." Marcus stared at the screen, Sarah's innocent concern cutting through his guilt like acid. She would go to college, would have opportunities he'd never had, would live in a world where her father's moral cowardice had purchased her future. And someday, when Rodriguez burned out completely, the entity would need another good man to corrupt, another righteous soul to sustain its hunger. "The curse doesn't end, does it?" Marcus asked. "It just moves from one generation to the next, one good cop to another." "Now you understand," Vincent said. "The entity doesn't want evil men. They're too easy to corrupt, too willing to feed it. It wants heroes like Rodriguez, like your grandfather, like you. It wants men who believe in justice so strongly they'll become monsters to achieve it." Marcus typed back to Sarah, coming home soon. "Save me some pancakes." As he walked toward his car, Vincent called after him. "You'll see Rodriguez again, detective. In a few years, when the next storage locker turns up, when another young officer starts asking questions about supernatural justice. And you'll have to decide again. Do you take the razor to save him, or do you let another good man damn himself for the greater good?" Marcus didn't answer. He drove home through empty Queen streets, past closed shops and sleeping families, carrying the weight of Rodriguez's sacrifice, and the certainty that this was only the beginning. The entity was fed, the curse continued, and somewhere in the darkness, justice wore the face of damnation. Marcus pulled into his driveway as dawn painted the Queen's sky the color of old blood. The house looked exactly as he'd left it. Weathered blue siding, Sarah's bicycle chained to the porch rail, yesterday's mail still stuffed in the rusty box. But everything felt different now, as if he were seeing it through glass that had been cracked from the inside. The front door opened before he reached it. Sarah stood there in her worn NYU sweatshirt and flannel pajama pants, 17 years old and beautiful in that unconscious way of daughters who haven't yet learned to doubt themselves. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there were circles under her eyes that told him she'd been awake all night waiting. "Dad?" She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and for a moment Marcus couldn't breathe. She smelled like vanilla shampoo and the lavender detergent her mother had always used, and beneath that the particular sweetness that had been uniquely Sarah's since she was small. "I saw the news. They said there was shooting, federal agents." "I'm okay." The lie came automatically, practice from decades of protecting civilians from the weight of what good men carried. Just a long night. She pulled back to study his face with the penetrating gaze she'd inherited from him. The one that had made her elementary school teachers nervous and would someday make her an excellent lawyer or investigator or whatever she chose to become. "You look different." "Tired," he said, but even as the word left his mouth he knew it wasn't enough. Tired didn't explain the way his reflection had looked foreign in the car's rearview mirror, or how his hands had felt like they belonged to someone else when he'd turned his key in the ignition. Sarah frowned but led him inside, where the smell of pancake batter and coffee created an illusion of normalcy so perfect it felt cruel. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered, mismatched chairs around a scarred wooden table, Sarah's textbooks stacked beside her laptop, the morning light streaming through windows that needed washing but somehow made everything look golden anyway. "Sit," Sarah commanded, and Marcus obeyed because refusing would require explanations he couldn't give. She moved around the kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who'd been taking care of herself and him for longer than either of them wanted to admit. Pancakes appeared on his plate, perfectly golden, accompanied by the real maple syrup she'd splurged on with her part-time job money. Marcus took a bite and tasted nothing. The pancakes could have been cardboard. The syrup could have been motor oil. His taste buds had apparently gone numb, along with everything else that used to work properly inside him. "The storage unit money," Sarah said suddenly, settling across from him with her own plate. "It came through, right? The federal guys didn't confiscate everything?" Marcus nodded, remembering the certified check that had arrived yesterday, payment for consulting services rendered to federal law enforcement. Enough to cover Sarah's first year at Columbia, maybe her second if they were careful. Blood money, purchased with Rodriguez's damnation, but money nonetheless. Sarah's relief was visible, and Marcus felt something twist in his chest. "I know how worried you've been about tuition. I've seen you staying up nights with those auction catalogs, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You're a good dad, you know that?" The words hit him like physical blows. Good dad, good man. All those comfortable labels that had once felt solid now seemed translucent, revealing the hollow spaces underneath where Rodriguez's sacrifice echoed like footsteps in an empty house. "Sarah," he started, then stopped. What could he say? That her college fund had been purchased with supernatural currency? That somewhere in Queens a young police officer was learning to murder in the name of justice? That her father had chosen her future over another man's soul? "Whatever happened last night," she said quietly, "it's over now. You're home. We're safe. That's what matters." But it wasn't over. It would never be over. Vincent had made that clear. The entity would need feeding again, and eventually Rodriguez would burn out like a candle in a hurricane. Then there would be another storage locker, another good man faced with impossible choices, another opportunity for Marcus to decide between heroism and cowardice. Marcus looked at his daughter, brilliant, determined, deserving of every opportunity he could give her, and felt the weight of what he'd become. Not a hero, not a villain, Something worse, a man who'd learned to let others pay the price for his moral certainties. "Yeah," he said finally, forcing himself to taste the pancakes, to smile at her obvious relief, to perform the role of father returning safely from work. "We're safe." Outside, the October morning was crisp and clear, full of promise for people who hadn't spent the night learning the true cost of justice. Marcus ate breakfast with his daughter, discussed her college applications, and pretended that salvation hadn't turned out to be just another word for sacrifice. The breakfast dishes sat in the sink, abandoned when Sarah rushed to catch her bus to school. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, watching her disappear around the corner in a flash of navy backpack and determined stride. She moved through the world with the confident grace of someone who still believed problems had solutions, that good men made good choices, that justice and morality walked hand in hand down well-lit streets. He envied her that certainty. Once he'd possessed it too. The house settled into its familiar daytime quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the hallway clock, the distant sound of Mrs. Chen next door starting her ancient Honda. Normal sounds for a normal morning in a normal life, except Marcus could no longer pretend he lived in that world. The supernatural had carved out space inside his chest, a cold hollow where his certainties used to live. His phone rang. Rodriguez's name on the caller ID. "It's done," the young officer said, without preamble. His voice sounded different, flatter, as if emotion had been carefully scraped away. 17 dead, no survivors, the children they would have taken are safe. Marcus closed his eyes. "Miguel." "The visions are clearer now," Rodriguez continued. "I can see the next one's coming. A trafficking ring operating out of Chinatown. 3 families planning to disappear next week. A pause. The razor. It shows me things. Terrible things that haven't happened yet. Things I can prevent. At what cost?" Rodriguez laughed, and the sound contained no humor whatsoever. "You ask that like you don't already know. Like you didn't make the same calculation when you watched me pick up that blade." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not angry, Marcus. I understand now. You chose to save yourself so you could go home to Sarah, so she could have a father who sleeps at night instead of a monster who hunts in the dark." Marcus thought about the pancakes he'd forced himself to eat, the smile he'd managed for his daughter, the lie about everything being over. "Do you sleep?" "No. But I see justice being served. I see monsters stopped before they can create new victims. I see a world where good men don't have to choose between action and morality because someone else has already chosen for them." Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see the storage facility in the distance, its rows of metal buildings baking under the morning sun. Unit #247 would be empty now, swept clean by federal agents, no trace remaining of Vincent's barbershop or the supernatural curse it had housed. But the curse itself lived on in Rodriguez, fed by righteous fury and sustained by terrible necessity. "There will be others," Rodriguez said, as if reading his thoughts. "When I burn out, when the entity consumes whatever's left of Miguel Rodriguez, there will be another storage locker, another desperate man, another choice between damnation and paralysis." His voice carried the weight of prophecy. "You'll be there, won't you? To guide the next one, to help him understand the price of refusing the call?" Marcus felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but his last illusion that this story had an ending. He was part of the cycle now, complicit in its continuation, doomed to watch good men make impossible choices, while he stood safely aside with clean hands and dirty conscience. "I'll be there," he said, because lying would have been crueler. After Rodriguez hung up, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and tried to remember what normal felt like. He had work to do, storage, auctions to attend, antiques to appraise, a business to run. Sarah would come home from school with stories about her classes and plans for the weekend. They would order pizza, watch bad movies, pretend that her college fund hadn't been purchased with supernatural currency. The certified check sat on his dresser upstairs, enough money to give his daughter every opportunity he'd dreamed of providing. She would never know what it had cost, would never understand that her future had been bought with another man's soul. She would go to Columbia, become a lawyer or a doctor or whatever she chose to be, live the life Marcus had sacrificed everything to make possible. And someday, when Rodriguez's name appeared in the obituaries, another good cop dead too young, another hero consumed by the job, Sarah might read about it over her morning coffee, feel a moment's sadness for the waste of it, then turn the page to something less depressing. She would never know that her college education had been written in his blood. Marcus looked at his hands, steady, clean, unburdened by supernatural obligation. These hands had never held Vincent's razor, had never felt the electric thrill of absolute justice, had never been stained by the blood of guilty men. They were the hands of a good father, a moral man, someone who'd chosen salvation over damnation. They felt like they belonged to someone else. Outside, October settled into Queens like a comfortable lie, painting the world in colors that promised winter's honest death instead of autumn's beautiful decay. Marcus Delacroix sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the life he'd chosen to preserve, and learned to live with the weight of letting other men pay for his redemption. Some curses, he realized, were more terrible than damnation. The curse of surviving when good men didn't.